I'll just try to be quiet.
And then you have to second release.
Yeah.
Interviewee.
Alright guys, holler if you need anything.
Roger that. Come on.
Just video proof of this happening. Video proof of this happening.
And then I guess we can just like, you can take a snapshot with that, can't you?
Yeah.
Can you set like a timer with it?
I don't know.
For what?
Because we need to take a picture. Oh.
There's other people in the house.
Well, I figured we just all like.
Great.
Everything's good? We're rolling? Okay. Hello. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Your name, where you're from, family life before the war?
Okay, my name is Nicholas Pyle. I was born in South Carolina, but only stayed 6 months there. Basically grew up in and around Chicago. Grew up in a small town called Libertyville, in a family that ultimately swelled to 7 kids, and went to the local high school.
Sorry, guys. Okay.
There are zombies trying to get into your house. And just for the audio, I just wanted to inform them
Okay,
that
yeah.
it is a zombie.
Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Alright.
Sorry. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Calm down. Okay.
Okay, I'm good.
Okay. Went to the local high school, and from there I went to Harvard University, where I was in ROTC, in Army ROTC, which I chose because it had the shortest duration of active service of 2 years when I got out, and I would be an officer with a reserve commission, which is what I did. Like most of the people in my ROTC class, I applied to Army intelligence, and like most of the people in my class, that's what I got into. And so that's me up to being in the Army now.
So, your job, you were an intelligence officer?
Yes, I guess I would be called not an intelligence officer in the sense of an intelligence officer in a unit. I was actually an officer working in an intelligence unit, which had people, it was a combined unit with people from different services and from different countries. So it wasn't like I was the intelligence officer for a regular unit, intelligence, infantry unit or anything like that.
Right. What did your job entail? Like, what was a typical day like?
Well, I suppose we have to get me to Vietnam first.
Right. That, you know.
Which is that all the intelligence officers go through a infantry basic trainings, as though it's the same training that people who go into infantry have. And then after that, that takes 6 months, as I recall. And then we went to intelligence school in Fort Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland, where we were supposedly taught some intelligence skills. There was a big push to get people through right then, because this was in 1965, and there was the big Lyndon Johnson buildup of the Vietnamese War. So people were being really kind of poured through, and I was one of the people that just had the basic intelligence sort of orientation, finding out what the different aspects of intelligence are, without having any specific training in any branch of intelligence. So then my unit, which was called 519th Intelligence Battalion, which is part of the 525th Intelligence Brigade, was sent down to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where we were to await being sent over to Vietnam. We were told that what we were going to be doing was advising Vietnamese Army units in various sort of different provinces, which was which was something that we were not not very happy about because we felt we hadn't really learned anything to advise them in or about. But we were sent over there. We went by boat because we were going as a whole unit, and went from Charleston down through the Panama Canal up, stopped in Long Beach. Actually switched ships because the crew said that the one we were on wasn't going to make it across the Pacific. Then we got on another one, sort of putted across the Pacific and through the Philippines, and then up the Saigon River. We were actually the first ship to go up the Saigon River in about a year because there had been, it used to be that they went up and down all the time, but one had been fired upon. By the time we went up there, that had so much defoliation that nobody could fire on us. And we went all the way up to Saigon and out to a tent city, which was a place where people who came into Saigon were put to wait until they were given their orders to go on to whatever different jobs they went to in different locations. And there were people like Korean Army units came through, and Air Force units and Army units. And we just kind of sat there with no orders to go, and other units would come in and go out, come in and go out. And we still sat there, and it was winter, just the end of 1965, beginning of 66. We actually made it to see the Bob Hope show just before Christmas. And eventually, people kept asking the colonel in charge of our unit, when were we going to go? And he said, oh, you'll get your orders, And we just sat there with nothing to do, day in and day out. And finally, some of them just got on a bus to go around this Tonsanute Air Force Base, which is where this tent city was. And they just happened to find a place that said it was the Combined Intelligence Center of Vietnam. So they wandered into it. The security was kind of minimal, and found that they had some friends from their training who were working there as things like imagery interpreters, where you look at photographs and decide what's there, and order of battle people, and
I'm sorry.
okay, so they found people who were doing the things that some of the people who had gone through before me had actually learned something to do, and some of them were imagery interpreters, for instance, and they said, oh, you guys, I see you're doing imagery interpreting. Would you like for us to help you? And they said, sure, yeah, why not? So these people came back to the tent city and to our big tent, and with a lot of mimeographed sheets of paper saying, if you were working in an intelligence center, what would you do? And I hadn't had any training in anything specific, so I just wrote down editing. I could do editing because I didn't require any specific knowledge. And so they asked the colonel, is it okay if we go work in this intelligence center? He said, well, yeah, it's okay, but we're going to be getting our orders. So pretty soon. So you may have to stop. Yeah, fine. Okay, so we all went over there and started working. We set up an editing section, and with me and a few other people, some enlisted men, and whenever people in the other parts of the unit would make reports, they would come through the editing section to turn them into a little more proper English and more understandable. So that was basically what I did during the time that I was working in intelligence in Vietnam. I lived in the city. Another thing was that we wanted to find someplace to live. So finally we asked them if it was okay if we found our own places to live in the city. And they said, well, yeah, but you're going to get your orders pretty soon, so you may have to quit. Okay, that's fine. So we found places, which is where we ended up living for the entire year that we were there. We never did get the orders. In fact, somebody claimed that he had seen a secret document in the intelligence center saying that we were always meant to staff that center, but in order to get more material, more basically vehicles and things, it had to be set up so that it seemed like we were going out to other locations, but we never got orders to do so. So we all had various trucks and drove around in trucks and jeeps and things. So that was basically my work day was just doing. It was just going over intelligence reports, which would have been. Actually, I did spend a little time at the beginning working on an area intelligence in which we were we would receive requests for intelligence about some particular area, what the conditions were like, would it be appropriate for kinds of warfare and so forth. And the one report that I was involved with was a request to see if an area would be suitable for armored warfare, meaning tanks.
Right.
So we did our study, and we decided that because of the nature of the terrain, it really wasn't suited for tanks, and so we sent that up, and they went ahead and sent tanks. And so that was how useful they found us. But then the rest of the time I was an editor, and then I lived in town in Saigon, which was before the Tet Offensive, when it became sort of much more restricted. So we were able to just kind of wander around wearing civilian clothes and go to restaurants and bars on the tops of hotels and things, because it was basically considered safe. Right across the river, it was not safe. It was not built up. It was just kind of a wilderness, and you would see helicopters shooting tracer bullets down to something that was going out there, and we never knew what it was. But we were pretty much restricted to the city itself, so we spent all our time in the city of Saigon.
So you were there for 2 years, or
1 year. It was the tour of duty in Saigon at that time for the Army was a single year, and part of that time had been spent on the boat. That was considered part of our tour. So it was actually less than a year that I was over there, and then went back and had some other kind of time-filling assignment after that, and that filled my whole 2-year enlistment, or my 2-year commission.
and what year were you in Vietnam?
1966, pretty much calendar 1966.
Right. So you when editing, did you ever find something that stood out to you, something that just made you go, wow?
No, not really. It was pretty much run-of-the-mill things. We had a section that did order of battle that was supposed to get reports of what enemy units were in what locations and at what strengths, and they would make a report to send it up. That would come through us, and we would just had no way of, it wasn't like, oh my God, there's some big movement going on. It was all fairly low key at that point.
Mm-hmm. So it was mostly about just intelligence and not like reports of, reports from American soldiers of, like battles that have taken place, or
No. It was all, there would be specific requests for a specific kind of report, and then that request would be filled by either order of battle or the imagery. If somebody wanted to have visual imagery or radar imagery or something, they would request that, and that would be done by the Air Force or the Army air people, and then those things would come back to the imagery interpretation, where people would look at it and decide what was in the pictures, and those weren't basically reports that would come through us. So mainly we would be dealing with order of battle, meaning what units and what strength were where, and area. There were also some strategic reports that were made up, recommendations and things that would come through.
Going back to Harvard, when you joined the ROTC program, Did you do that because you knew you would be drafted anyway, or did you know you would be sent to Vietnam? Or
When I first went in, it was not really an inevitability. That was 1960, and things were very small scale at that time. We just had a few advisors over there. I really went in because there was sort of a family tradition, really, and I was just following it. I had 3 other brothers who also went into the military, and they all went to Vietnam in one capacity or another.
I see. So you showed up in Vietnam on your first day, and did you feel like not prepared? Like, was it very stressful? Did you feel in constant danger? Did you feel underprepared for, or was it just kind of a regular old city just in another part of the world?
Well, I guess I was sort of naive, I must say, because I remember wandering around this big Air Force base where you get on a bus and it would sort of take you around. You wait at a bus stop for the next bus to come by to pick you up. And I was sitting with a group of people, and I heard a little bit of automatic weapons fire in the distance. And I said, no, that's nowhere near. But I suddenly looked around, I saw everybody but me had hit the dirt and were lying in the ditch. And I was the only one dumb enough to just be standing there thinking, well, nothing's going to happen. You know, we're on an Air Force base, what would happen? Mm-hmm. I knew that there had been some incidents of bombing within the city. There was a hotel called the Victoria Hotel where a lot of people who had come in ahead of me had been billeted. And there's one guy who worked in the center who was a naval ensign whose name was Ensign Sandberg, and everybody called him Ensign Sandbag because he was so stupid. But he had been on one of the upper floors of the Victoria Hotel when there had been a bomb that kind of blew in all the windows, and he wandered out into his, I guess he had been in the shower, and he wandered out into his living room to see what had happened, and he actually cut his foot on the broken glass from the window, for which he was awarded a Purple Star. So we always knew that there was the possibility, but the odds were that nothing was going to happen because so little did happen. Now, when people would come, military people would come in who had been out in the field, who had been out in actual combat situations or closer to combat situations, they were always they lived in compounds with very heavy security around them, and all the people that worked there, all the Vietnamese that worked there had been vetted, and they all wore IDs and everything. And then when they went out, they were all in formation and in convoys and with their weapons. Then when they came down to Saigon, they were freaked out because there was no security. They were surrounded by Vietnamese who hadn't been vetted and weren't wearing their IDs and things, and they felt very nervous and wanted to get back up to where they had been.
Wow.
So it was an odd sort of situation.
See. I'm sorry. So 1966, how much information did you have about what was going on in America at the time?
Limited. The newspaper, the Stars and Stripes was the Armed Forces newspaper, and we'd read what they had. But it wasn't like there was a television available with CNN on it. It didn't exist. So we would basically hear anything that people would tell us in letters, but we weren't. In '66, there wasn't a whole lot of reaction to the war, because at that time it was being just built up, and people were just becoming aware of how much of an effect it was having on the country. After I got back, it got considerably more contentious.
Mm-hmm. were you in Vietnam at the like at the time of any major events that the war is like remembered for, or did you have any? I guess what was like the experience with other soldiers, like you were saying, like in combat roles? Did you have much? Did they? Were they kind of shell shocked? Did you get freaked out by experience with others?
The people that I met, no. There had been, there were places that were being fired. I can't really remember the chronology of this. I mean, I remember certain big offenses, certain big things that happened, but I really don't remember whether they happened while I was there or when I got back, because they were so divorced from our world within Saigon. But I don't recall meeting anybody who, seemed terribly stressed out by the war.
I assume.
Not that I met that many people who were out there in combat, because they didn't spend a lot of time with us.
I assume you and the people you worked with generally weren't too stressed over there?
Not really. I mean, once we found out we didn't have to go out to be advisors in some boondocks, we decided we could live a relatively comfortable life in the city and drive to work in this little place. It seemed like not a bad gig, frankly.
So you lived in the city? I mean,
Yeah.
like where exactly did you live? Was it like an apartment you
Well,
rented out, or?
I lived in two different places. First half of the time, several other in my unit, some other lieutenants, and I got together and rented a house that faced onto the main market. It was a big square. It may have been one of the main markets, but it was a main market, a big square where just open air market kind of thing, where there were pavilions, tents, and things, and you wandered through the labyrinth. And on three sides, there were just like, I guess you'd call them row houses, of which the basically there were two stories, and the bottom story was usually used for some sort of commercial activity. It was a restaurant or a store, and then the upper floor was used to live in. We just lived in both levels, and so we had the sort of sounds and smells and sights of the market out in front all that time, which is sort of interesting. It was just right along one of the main thoroughfares that went out to the Air Force Base where we worked. So on one side it was the highway, and then on the other three sides were all these buildings. This second half of the time I was there, I lived in a rather typical situation where somebody who owned a fairly good-sized house and a fairly good-sized piece of land in a nice residential area of Saigon had built a sort of a motel-like housing, which they would then rent out to people in the military and to civilian contractors, just sort of indiscriminate mix of these people. And so one of my roommates and I decided to move into one of those places, which was a little more comfortable and less noisy and smelly, and was reasonably convenient. It was a little far closer to the downtown, which made it nice too, so that you could go fairly easily downtown and catch a cab and go into town to the various downtown activities.
So it sounds like it was pretty lenient for, I mean, generally when you think of someone in the military, they're like living on a base and having a very strict schedule, but it seems like you had a bit more relaxed of an experience.
I mean, people overseas, there are a lot of situations like this. I gather, I've not been to other places, but I've talked to people who have been in other big military units like Ramstein in Germany or Subic Bay in the Philippines and things, where you didn't really have to live, like particularly people with families didn't have to live on the base, and they were fairly free to to move around. And this was just since the Tet Offensive, which was sort of a watershed, hadn't occurred yet. There was no particular reason for us to have to be on base. And the fact is that they were building, excuse me, they were building billets, and they had taken over hotels and things, and hadn't done so much building, but they had taken over hotels for, I mean, you know, leased hotels for use by the military before I got there. And so most of the military that was living off base was living in this sort of place, but that's because there were relatively few people there before. There was, as I said, the Johnson buildup was happening while I was there, and so people were just pouring in, and they were trying to build new housing for them, but they couldn't keep up with it. So there was just really no available military housing for us. The only alternative to the tent city, because we didn't have any specific orders to stay there, the only alternative was to live in the city, on the economy as they referred to it.
Right. Did most of the soldiers that were there with you, did they feel any resentment towards what was going on at the time, or since it was pre-Tet Offensive, was everyone kind of on board with the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people there had gone in of their own accord, and this was just, you know, that nobody wanted to go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, some people were very well connected, didn't have to go. I had one fellow that I knew in the Army who was the descendant of one of the founders of Standard Oil. He had a fairly posh upbringing, and he got a job with NATO headquarters, actually. I guess it was in Paris, where he spent much of his time living, and learned French in a Swiss boarding school and stuff. So people like that could easily avoid that. But most of the people at that time were just sort of shunted off to Vietnam. One of my brothers had learned, a few years after me, the younger brother, had been sent to language school and had been taught Serbo-Croatian, and assumed that he was going to be sent somewhere over to Yugoslavia, but in fact he was sent over to Vietnam to listen to radios. He was in the Marines.
So, just out of curiosity, what did your brothers do? Like, were they officers with you, or did they just enlist in different branches?
There were 4 different situations. I had one older brother who went into the Army, and I can't remember exactly how it went, but he went into the Army and was in the paratroopers in the 101st Airborne, but then he got out of the Army. But then in Vietnam, I guess he decided he wanted to go back into the Army, so he was quite young, so that he could get into the thick of things. So he joined up again, and this time was in the 92nd Airborne Division, and he learned to fly helicopters. So he was over there flying helicopters in combat situations. So he had a very scary kind of a time in Vietnam. My next younger brother went into the Navy, and he was assigned to a destroyer which spent 6 months off the shore of Vietnam, not really doing anything, just being very hot and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then the other one was the one who was in the Marines, and he was sent pretty much out into the boonies to listen to radios, and he could never tell us what it was that he was doing because it was all classified. So there were quite different situations. All the others we all volunteered. Nobody was drafted. My 2 younger brothers were enlisted and stayed enlisted all the time. My older brother had enlisted, but he went to officer candidate school and got a commission, and when he got out of the Army, he was a captain.
You and your brother could pull rank on your younger brothers.
Easily.
So you were back in America by 1967, around there?
Yeah, came back in, I think it was December of '66,
Mhm.
and then got out of the Army in June of '67.
What were you doing between December and June for them?
Well, I was sent to Fort Leonard Wood, which is in the Ozarks in Missouri,
Mhm.
in a very beautiful area. It's quite
Oh, yeah.
quite pleasant. It's a huge base, and I was assigned seemingly arbitrarily to a signal unit company, where the people mostly did things like put up power poles and repair them and that sort of thing.
Mm.
And in that case, I was considered, I guess, that I was the communications officer, but I didn't really. It was another one of these situations. I had really nothing specific to do. I was just there. I had to get up in the morning, go to the office, and try to think of ways of amusing myself until I finally rotated out of the Army and I stayed in. Had a reserve commission, which was why I only had to spend 2 years. Then I had a few years of active reserve where I had to go to meetings and summer camp, and then inactive reserve after that while I was in graduate school.
Mm-hmm. So you continued your education when you were essentially done with the Army?
Yeah, it was when I got off in June of '67. I had gotten my commission in June of '64 when I graduated, but they rotate people through, every month rather than having everybody come in at once. They, everybody goes in some sort of group, and I went into the very last group the following June. So I had to do something in most of that year after graduation, and then when I got out, I had the summer free, and then I went into architecture school at the University of Illinois, and then after 1 year there, that was at Chicago, after 1 year there, I applied to Princeton's graduate school of architecture, and I went to Princeton after that, and I spent 3 years there.
So your jobs in the military, they all seem kind of, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but they seem, I mean,
Be as disrespectful as you want.
no, they just seem kind of like civilian jobs. Like they kind of seemed like office jobs in a sense.
Mhm.
So I take it wasn't too hard to get readjusted back into civilian life.
Yeah, I had absolutely no
Yeah.
PTSD.
Yeah.
No, no.
Were
No, it wasn't. It was. There wasn't stress so much as the regular stress of working in a unit and having to deal with the people that have authority over you, or the people that you have to have authority over, which is more when I was in the in the United States. But no war stress kind of thing at all. There are a lot of people, in the military who don't go anywhere near
Yeah,
combat. They're
yeah.
in the support roles, and so they
those are roles no one
they,
knows about?
they
but-
just do, they fix jeeps, or they
Mhm.
fix airplanes, or they do clerk typist work. Or,
Yeah.
you know.
There's all sorts of non-combat jobs. Did you how did you feel about the war after you were out, like after the Tet Offensive?
Well, being there did not give me a great deal of confidence in the people that were running the war, either at a high level or at a low level. I just, it didn't seem like people really knew what they were doing, and were doing it very well. I had a good friend from Fort Leonard Wood who went to Vietnam just before I got out of the Army. He was in the infantry, and he was a second lieutenant, and he was in charge of a battalion, and they went on combat missions all the time, but he described them as being a situation where helicopters would come in and make a huge amount of noise, and they would land, and the people would get out, and then they would spend all the first half an hour trying to get themselves organized and yelling, "Charlie, Conway, where are you?" and trying to get themselves in shape, and then, okay, finally we're ready to do something. By that time there was no enemy anywhere nearby. It was just like these guys are coming again. I guess we better get out of here. And then they would go through all that stuff, and it just seemed like a stupid waste of time and money. And they would go on. You know, they'd have to march from here to there, and a few of them would get picked off from the side. So it was dangerous for them. But it was very difficult to engage the enemy because the enemy wasn't going to just stand around waiting to get engaged.
And they were going to let you see them either. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Did you get any? I mean, I assume because of the timeline, you probably didn't get much, like, personal resentment for having served in the war.
No. There were, when I came back, there were people that said, "Well, why did you go there?" And I, just explained, and that was that. I never felt that the war was particularly useful for anybody, and I didn't understand why they were doing it. I pretty much felt that it was a stupid war, and we shouldn't have been involved at all.
Like most people.
Like, yeah, I guess most people, although probably my older brother would not agree.
Yeah.
He probably thought it was great. But, yeah, I'll have to stop them there before they come over here.
Did you, I mean, you didn't go out and, like, join a bunch of rallies about end the war and...
No, well, for one thing, I was still in the army for several years afterwards. So it was not. Interestingly, there was the 1968 Democratic Convention you may have read was held in Chicago, and I was on active reserve then. And they were afraid that there were going to be a lot of demonstrations. In fact, there were considerable demonstrations outside the convention because the Democrats were in power at that time. And as you recall, Mayor Richard J. Daley put them down quite harshly and put on television saying, "No, the police here aren't here to how do you say it? We're not here to now I've totally lost it. We're not here to prevent disorder. We're here to preserve disorder." Which everybody said, "What?" but our unit was based in Chicago and it was all full of Chicagoans, so they told us that the people from the Milwaukee National Guard or Army Reserve unit would be brought in if there was any problems in Chicago that required military intervention, and then if there was anything in Milwaukee, we'd go up there. There wasn't anything in Milwaukee, and they didn't bring the army in to help preserve the disorder in Chicago. So basically, nothing. We were just on call, 24 hours a day in case there was something.
And there never was.
No, we weren't called up.
So, when you were in reserves, there's obviously the chance that you can get called back to service. Take it that didn't happen?
Did not happen, no. And then when I went to Princeton, I was still supposed to be going to meetings, but there wasn't anywhere nearby, and they didn't make me go to meetings.
So you just didn't.
So I just kind of was there in case they needed me.
That sounds like you're kind of the theme of your entire military experience. I was just kind of there in case they needed me.
Yeah.
Well,
There's very people who've been in the military generally come out with the idea that things are just not run very well, and that there's a huge waste of money and effort and very poor direction for the most part.
And
in my experience.
you feel the same way, I take it.
Yeah, I don't have great confidence
Yeah.
in those guys that are running things.
Did you before you had personal experience?
I didn't really have any. I guess I assumed things were reasonably well run. I hadn't read. Well, when did I read Catch-22? I think it was in the Army when I read Catch-22.
Mm-hmm.
Have any of you read that?
I have not.
It's a great World War II era book in which it takes place in the South Pacific, but it just kind of sort of exaggerates and makes surreal the actual situation with the incompetence of the people and the ridiculousness of the rules. In fact, the Catch-22, the name came from some, I guess it's a regulation that said, you know, the only way of getting out of the army is to prove that you're insane, but then if you want to get out of the army, that proves that you're not insane.
Yeah, that is a catch-22. Did you have, like, was there, like, that guy that, you know, like, kind of personified the incompetence that everyone kind of understood was...
Well, I always thought that the colonel in charge of the 519 Military Intelligence Battalion was sort of an example of that, because he just had no clue of what was happening. And he finally, like 6 months into the thing, he realized nothing was going to happen. He then took over some local jockey club and turned it into their headquarters, and then started feathering his nest and getting comfortable. But it was just...
So...
I mean, he didn't know anything about intelligence at all.
Yeah.
So,
your experience there made you kind of realize just how pointless the war was, but did, like, the events that happened in it, like the My Lai massacre and just the really terrible things that started happening towards the end, did that kind of strengthen your feelings or change them in any way, or?
that somehow, I guess so, because I became gradually more aware of what things were like out in the field after the war, when more of these things sort of were reported and these things happened. I mean, when I was there, there were some sort of ghastly things happening, like monks burning themselves, and that was sort of horrifying, but that was their sort of protest, and it wasn't something specifically we had done. But then I became much more aware of things, you know, the harshness of the way the army treated the people in villages and, you know, burned their houses and so forth. It was never really comfortable psychologically in Saigon. I always felt like we were in an occupying force. It wasn't like, you know, we were there because everybody wanted us to be there. It was just like we just sort of moved in, and now you have to kind of do what we tell you. But the people of Saigon are great entrepreneurs, and I mean, they just, for them, to a large extent, it was just a big opportunity to do business, and they did it at every level.
Yeah.
And it's still, Ho Chi Minh City, as it's now known, is still like that. It's the commercial center of Vietnam, and you go over there, and it's just, you know, very. I haven't been there, but I have numerous friends who have, and it's just hectically commercial there.
Because of that feeling that you're the occupying force and you're not, like, liberating or helping in any way, are you proud of your service?
I didn't think there was anything to be proud of. No, not really.
But you're not.
It was interesting, and I was glad to have done it, because my experience before that time had been quite limited. I had never been basically out of the country except into Canada a couple of times, and it was very exciting to be in Asia in a completely different environment. So I found it very stimulating, but there was nothing really to be proud of that I did. I didn't think my editing was anything to be particularly proud of. It was just,
But
I did it.
At the same time, you're not ashamed.
No, I didn't feel, I mean, I don't think that I was responsible for anything terrible happening. And I was ultimately ashamed for those people that were responsible for, but I didn't feel personally
Yeah.
part of that.
You were just doing a job.
Did you feel like it was unimportant what you were doing? Like it wasn't that important of a job?
Yeah, fairly unimportant, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some people used those reports and maybe they found them more understandable because I had edited them, and so maybe that was useful, but I wouldn't say terribly important.
So, I'm
By
sorry.
the way, I wondered how many of you have noticed.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
That was another great place in Saigon, was the Continental Palace Hotel, where we had been told that Graham Greene and people like that hung out there and ate lunches and had cocktails, so we liked to hang out there too. And then when Jay Peterman came up with this t-shirt, I had to have one.
Nice. So, would you be open to just like visiting Vietnam on vacation? Or?
Oh, I'd love to go there. I think one of these days I will go back to Saigon, and I'd also like to see Hanoi, because it's more of the old colonial city. When I was there, Saigon was pretty much the old French colonial city. It's not really much of that left anymore.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is, even though we bombed the hell out of Hanoi, there's still, I think they built it back up pretty much the way it was. Or I hope so, at any rate.
Yeah, sure hope so too. So, not a very. It was a pretty standard. Well, I wouldn't say standard because what was standard, but not a very stressful, or it wasn't too much. I'm trying to find my words here. It wasn't too much of a change from just the life you were used to. You know, it just.
Well, not in a bad way. I mean, it was quite different living, in a foreign city among foreign people, and being on my own to a large extent. Previous to that, I basically lived at home or with an aunt while I was working in Chicago or going to school. Well, going to school was afterwards, but otherwise I was living at home when I was growing up, or living on campus in the university. So I never had that sort of adult feeling of freedom that you have when you're really on your own. There's nobody looking over your shoulder, and you don't have to spend a whole evening working, doing homework.
Yeah.
Was it like when you came back to the U.S., was it like a big stress relief from you? Or like you felt like safer or something?
No, because I never really felt unsafe while I was there.
Well, do you guys have any questions?
Going back to what you said about, obviously living in a foreign country, were there like cultural changes that you had to get used to that, obviously were drastically different from living in the U.S.?
Minimally, because the American presence was so dominant. There were so many of us that the host country was basically in the business of accommodating us, and so we would talk to them in English all the time. My attempts to speak Vietnamese were not very good. They tried to teach us a little bit on the ship going over, and then we learned that it's an inflected language where the syllables go up or down, or up and down. They have little diacritical marks that show that, that's an up, that's a down, and that's an up and down. And so you had to say things right. And I was in a taxi cab one time trying to get him to go back to the market, and the word for market is spelled CHO, but it has a diacritical mark on it, and I didn't remember. So I was saying it the wrong way, and I kept saying I wanted to go to the market, and he kept getting slower and slower. And it turns out, if you say a different word, the same word means slower. So we were just barely creeping along. No, I want to go to the market.
So, Do you remember any Vietnamese? Just out of curiosity.
There's a few words that like for lieutenant is let's see, first lieutenant. Boy, can I remember it? Actually, all of a sudden it's gone away from my mind, but that's like practically everything else. At my age, I can't remember things, but I remember the girls at the checkout line at the PX would sort of want to make acquaintance with people because they would set up these situations where you'd buy things for them and they would accommodate you in whatever way you wanted, and so they would be very nice and say, "Oh, you're a very good-looking lieutenant," only in sort of broken Vietnamese and English. So I'm trying to remember this. The word that I keep coming up with is the word for the fish sauce. So I don't think that's the same one, but it's very close to that.
Well, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna like one last one to throw in there. So throughout this whole interview, I've just been constantly thinking about the kind of typical scenes from like movies of Vietnam where there's American servicemen and they're kind of just doing whatever they want, and whether it's abusing drugs or just burning a village because they want to. Is there anything that was like that you can remember that might have stuck with you, like someone came back to base and was like, "Hey, I just burned an entire village"?
No, because I think those burning villages aren't things that people bragged about. They tended to be the result of sort of built up anger, because they were fairly ineffectual in their attempts to stop the insurrection of the Viet Cong or the movements of the North Vietnamese army, and B, they were losing friends, and quite often in fairly horrifying ways. People, these punji steak things, stuff like that. So they built up a very strong feeling of dislike for the people there, which is very common, I think. That it's like they use very unattractive words to describe them, and even just nice people on the street. They were all part of that, and they would tend to think of them as being the other, and not worry so much about burning down the stuff because they had been doing things to them.
Right.
But it wasn't like, ha ha ha, I burned down a village.
Oh.
It's like, oh yeah, I did burn down a village.
Well, to recap, sounds like your experience was a lot better than many people can say theirs was.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we've got any more questions. No.
I think that about wraps it up.
Thank you very much. That was
All right.
very informative. And,
Thank you.
For the opportunity.
to talk to you.